What happened to movie tie-in games? In the early 2000s, almost every movie being released got a game. Polar Express, done. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, no problem. The SpongeBob movie, of course. And this didn't just apply to movies. The goddamn Sopranos fell victim to this too. Now I assume a lot of you watching knows who THQ is. You probably played one of their games, but if not, they're the people mostly responsible for these types of games. I mean, hell, most of these are on the 6th generation of consoles. Now the reason why there were so many was simple. They didn't have to create a story, they could reuse assets, it could be short, and most importantly, they did not have to be good. If you were listening to the list of movie games I mentioned earlier, you'd be able to tell that all three of them were kids movies. And kids are dumb. Who cares about what the gameplay looks like? Mom sees Garfield, Tale of Two Kitties on the shelf at the mall and goes, "Aw, look, they made Garfield for the Mario system. Timmy will love this." So of course, easy to make game plus gullible customers means money, right? Well, yes, but not for long. You see, when the 7th generation of consoles rolled around, the hardware was becoming so advanced, the games releasing for them were getting so much work put into them, so the lazy movie games weren't really cutting it anymore. Kids were starting to notice, hey, this GTA 4 game ain't looking too bad. And that's when little Timmy went from playing M&M kart racers to committing Grand Theft Auto at the age of 9. But those games didn't completely vanish yet, thanks to the Wii, for one, being graphically comparable to the GameCube, and two, having an audience be so broad, so these games were able to be ported over or just have new shitty games made for them. The Wii and DS consoles single-handedly carried the what's now called shovelware genre of games, which is where a lot of movie tie-in games can be thrown into. These games lived on until the early 2010s. To be fair, they started to die off in the late 2000s, but they were fighting to stay alive for a while, until one day they were just gone. Pretty much ceased to exist, with a couple strays here and there. Now, while movie tie-in games get a bad rap, there were a lot of gems, but with the amount released, I'd hope so. Games like Revenge of the Sith, the Spider-Man trilogy, all of the LEGO games, GoldenEye, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and Scott Pilgrim, even though that may not count, but you get my point. Not all of them were bad, but the majority were, and with hardware getting rapidly more advanced, they just didn't fit in anymore. But could these kinds of games make a comeback? Because they weren't just a trend that happened for a few years, no. Movie games were a thing ever since video games started. The most popular of these games was E.T. on the Atari 2600, and the reason why it was so popular was due to how bad it was. And it nearly killed gaming here in the US until the release of the NES. Nintendo had to promote their console as a toy, just because of how bad of a rap that E.T. gave to video games. For a few years, movie games still weren't the best, with others like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom releasing, which I don't even know what I'm doing in that game. But it wasn't until the release of the SNES when movie tie-in games started to become good for a while. Games like Super Star Wars, Aladdin, The Lion King, Batman, TMNT, and many more released with actual thought and care put into them, and a lot of them are cult classics to this day. Due to the hardware they released on, they didn't have to be graphically impressive, they could still be short and still be fairly fun. But when consoles started to shift to 3D on the 5th generation, these games had trouble adapting. Companies had to get used to making 3D models, and games were just left to the companies making original IPs and others who experimented around. But like I said before with the 6th generation consoles, companies became a little more comfortable making 3D games, and this is where the floodgates opened, with the GameCube and PS2 just being overflowed with these types of games. Almost every movie or TV show releasing around this time had a game releasing for it. Even older movies like The Godfather received video game ports just to make companies a quick buck, since consumers will buy the product based on the IP alone. Even if the game wasn't a complete one-to-one of the movie, games just based on the IP were made, but most of the time, these were the better of the bunch. But due to this oversaturation of bad games, consumers quickly started associating movie games with garbage, which is why they slowly started to fade out, and instead companies started to take these IPs and create brand new stories out of them, like with the Batman Arkham series, creating for more enjoyable experiences. It's crazy, right? The more effort you put into a game, the better it usually becomes. That's where they are today. Basically extinct, with games based on movie IPs coming out instead of games based on the movies themselves. But you see, there's a pattern. These games come out, suck, go away for a while, come back with a huge resurgence, and then just vanish again for a few more years, and the cycle repeats, whether it's better or for worse. The mid to late 2010s barely had any releases, and if they did, they were very small releases, barely even known or talked about. That was until recently. In the past few years, we've slowly started to get more games based on movies and shows like DC Super Pets, Jumanji, The Walking Dead Destinies, and more. There's not a lot of them, but I see them more often now than I do back in like 2017. Other games like Gollum and Skull Island aren't tie-in games to movies, but they still have that same movie tie-in vibe to them. But a trait shared between these new releases are that they're very bad. The IP-related games are still way more popular, with newer releases like Jedi Survivor, Hogwarts Legacy, and Spider-Man 2 blowing them away. That's because these developers have had a lot more creative freedom when making these projects, and in turn having more fun making them. The only company really keeping the good tie-in games alive are Traveler's Tales with their LEGO games, more recently making the Skywalker Saga. There was a lot of care put into the game, but since it's LEGO, they got to have more creative freedom when making it. They found a system for their games that works across different franchises, and people love those types of games. But with movie-related games becoming more popular over the last few years, maybe we'll eventually start seeing games directly based on movies and TV shows again. The Walking Dead Destinies was able to put a good twist on that, making a what-if type game story, but the problem with it is the game just wasn't good. Companies need to be less scared of making these types of games. Taking these stories and putting twists on them would be great. A good example being Revenge of the Sith, where the end of the game depends on who wins the final duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin. Imagine a game based on the original Star Wars trilogy, but depending on the player's actions, they can play the entire game going just like the movies, or they can make different choices that can end up having Luke join the dark side. I know that's probably not the best example, but ideas like that can allow movie tie-in games to still exist, while at the same time being their own thing, giving developers more creative freedom to make their game and giving players new and exciting content. But what do you think? Are movie tie-in games coming back? And if not, would you even want them to?